Good evening, everybody. I'm Dick Miles, Chair of Alaska Common Ground, and it's my privilege on behalf of our Board of Directors to welcome you all. We hope tonight's discussion on Alaska's redistricting process will give you a better understanding of this complex issue. This discussion is timely as the deadline to submit comments on Alaska's redistricting plan is rapidly approaching. We cannot conduct the work we do without the support of people like you. Please consider becoming a member or donating online at alaskacommonground.org. We will put a link to this address in the chat. This event is being recorded in case you or your friends want to watch it later on the Alaska Common Ground website. If you want to ask questions of our presenter tonight or provide feedback during the event, please write them in Zoom's Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. Every 10 years, new legislative district boundaries are drawn based on the most recent census data. On September 20th, the Alaska Redistricting Board adopted 6 proposed redistricting plans, which they are presenting at public meetings across Alaska. Alaska Common Ground has invited Senator Tom Begich to discuss what fair redistricting looks like and why it matters. This is a Zoom webinar, so everyone's audio is muted this evening, except for the presenters. The event will run about an hour. Our speaker tonight is Senator Tom Begich. He is the Alaska State Senate Minority Leader and the State Senator for District J, which is the heart of urban Anchorage. Tom has been involved with reapportionment since the 1980s. In 1991, he was an expert witness for the state on socioeconomic relationships and authored a number of reports for that year's board on this topic. He again served as a state expert in the 2001 process, a role he has also played at the end of the 2011 process after initially working with a number of private clients on redistricting, including Sea Alaska Corporation, Chalista Corporation, and L. Adams and Associates. In this reapportionment cycle, he has worked with the Minority Caucus and others to develop a plan for consideration for this process, while also reviewing other plans. That plan was one of 6 adopted by the board for public consideration. He is here today to discuss the basics of the process, where the redistricting board currently is in the process, and what we might expect, and also to answer your questions. Remember to post your questions in the Q&A link on your screen, and Alaska Common Board member Cliff Groh will pose as many questions as possible to Tom after his presentation. With that, Tom, thank you for being here tonight, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Dick, and thank you for the invitation. First, let me check with you as the moderators to make sure that you can hear me clearly.
Yes, I can. Cliff is giving thumbs up as well.
That's what we like. You know, I've presented to the board of reapportionment board a couple of times where the audio is cut out or the video is cut out. If anything like that happens, I'll be sure to try and text you or otherwise get a hold of you. But today I am going to take about 20 minutes to walk folks through the initial process and describe some of the elements of redistricting. And before I share my screen, though, I want to just sort of lay out for you out there who don't know how our board is created and how our process fits in the grand scheme of redistricting boards around the country, what that process is like. I'll then talk about where the current board is at, what they've been doing, and then talk about the timeline and what we can expect over the next month and a half. So to start with, we have a unique process here in Alaska that was changed in 1998. That process allows for 2 of our 5 members to be appointed by the governor first, followed by an appointee from the president of the Senate that would have been in the prior legislature. And then in the prior legislature, the Speaker of the House appoints a member. And then the then Supreme Court Justice Joel Bolger appointed a member. So Chief Justice. So each of them got to appoint 1 member, and those members have to be distributed so that there's 1 for each of our 4 judicial districts, and then a 5th that can come from any one of the 4 judicial districts. So that is the process that creates our board. In this case, we ended up with board members that have fairly strong Alaska Native interests. We have 2 Alaska Natives, a vice president of AFN, a leader in the Bering Straits, Quark in the Bering Straits region, an of council to Sea Alaska, and then a member of the Alaska Policy Forum, and then former state House and state Senate member John Binkley, who represented Bethel in the House and the Senate. So a fairly diverse board. The board has, as I understand it, 2 nonpartisans and 3 Republicans on it. Though generally here party affiliation because of the process doesn't have as much impact, it is something worth noting. So what the board is charged to do is serve for the entire life of consideration of plans. So throughout all the process, maps will be drawn, there'll be lawsuits potentially filed if they are filed. This board stays intact until the last of those lawsuits is resolved. They are, in the Constitution, given the responsibility to finalize all plans. So I just wanted to lay out that kind of sort of the play of how we got our board in the first place. Now what I'd like to do is, assuming I can do this right, share my screen and walk you through a little PowerPoint. And it says here, I think I can do this, yeah. Here we go. So let me walk you through some of the redistricting basics, the things that the board has to consider as they go through this process. The first thing is this criteria, the redistricting criteria. Now, what this is there are, and if you just hold with me for a moment, I have to remove the, I have the panel thing in my way here. The redistricting criteria, in our Constitution, we outline 3 key components of redistricting. They are compactness, contiguity, socioeconomic integration as the 3 key parts. And then there's the 4th criteria that must be addressed, which are deviations from the ideal district size that effectively comes from the federal government side. So when we talk about each of these, let me walk through each of them. Socioeconomic integration basically prioritizes relationships that are already existing or ongoing. Boroughs, by their very definition, through the Borough Act, are like that, just as the municipality of Anchorage is like that. As are cities, areas that have voted or constituted themselves, have had an election or otherwise brought themselves together voluntarily, associated themselves, have, by definition, are socioeconomically integrated. So cities within boroughs are also considered by the courts through various court rulings to be higher levels of socioeconomic integration within a borough that may be considered in the redistricting process. To a lesser extent, ANCSA corporations, which were not formed through voluntary association, but rather through law, those, though, are considered associational boundaries, economic zones. In the past, we've used things like aquaculture associations, that kind of thing, where we can show prior historic relationships. And then there are other salient issues that come up from time to time. Are we have a common fishing culture? Do we shop or do we have common air transportation or road transportation? Those kinds of things. Compactness is very difficult in Alaska. That's your second criteria listed on my slide here. We have census blocks that need to be revised. Many of them are arbitrary. They create weird appendages, even in blocks that have no population. So sometimes you can see a map that shows a district that isn't compact because of the shape of census blocks, not because there was some nefarious effort. So you have to actually take a second look at those to make sure that that it isn't the shape, but rather some other instance that's caused the shape of the census block, but some other instance that's caused a particular odd shape. And in Alaska, we have, outside of the urban core, we really have very separated populations, almost like islands in the ocean when you think about Western Alaska or Northwestern Alaska. So that creates also a difficulty at addressing compactness that the courts have recognized. Contiguity is simply saying you can't have part of your district in Fairbanks, House District in Fairbanks, and part of your district in Anchorage, and nor can you have 2 House districts combined in a Senate district that don't actually touch each other. There's no real compactness provision for Senate districts, but there's a contiguity and a socioeconomic integration proviso. Finally, there's these deviations from the ideal size. Federally, state legislatures are held to a 5% from the mean up or 5% down, or 10% variation in terms of state legislative districts. But our courts have narrowed that very, very significantly and have said that at least in the Anchorage urban environments, if not other urban environments, that that percentage of plus or minus from the mean should be no more than 1% to 1.5%. And they've said that only in the '01 and and reaffirmed those in the 11 cases, the 2011 cases. So right now, the ideal House district's about 18,335 people. So you can go up, you could, in external to the urban areas, you could go up 5% from that or down 5% from that. And in the urban areas, which are still questionably defined because they're indeterminate at what we mean by that. We know Anchorage does fall under that. We don't know if Mat-Su, Fairbanks, or Kenai do, but within those areas, you're going to look for narrower deviations. And deviations are really a representation of one person, one vote. So, and then you also look at the overall plan's deviation. What does the lowest, negative deviation and the highest positive deviation, what combined is their overall amount? And we try to keep that under 10% for the entire map. So in Alaska, we have what's called the Hickel Process. This came out of the 1991 provisions in the lawsuit, where this is a quote from the Hickel decision. Priority must be given to the federal Constitution. Second, to the Federal Voting Rights Act. And I'll parenthetically say, since then, it's that Federal Voting Rights Act has effectively been gutted, so we do not have to submit our plans any longer to the Department of Justice to ensure that we're not discriminating. But generally, Alaska Native interests should be protected given the makeup of the board. But we'll be watching for that to make sure that they are. It's just important for you to know that the Voting Rights Act federally has been significantly weakened in court cases in the last decade, Supreme Court decisions in the last decade. And the third is to look at the requirements of Article 4, Section 6 of the Alaska Constitution. And those have a priority inter se as well, which are, first is contiguity and compactness. Second is relative socioeconomic integration. Third is whether we want to look at local government boundaries, and then we go on from there. The Hickel process stated in the court decision says you start from a blank map. You can't start from the last map. You start from a new one. So when you say, why does my district have to change? It's because the process requires you to start from a completely blank map and then first draw to meet our Alaska Constitution requirements of contiguity, compactness, socioeconomic integration, etc. Once we've done that, we hold it up against the lens of those federal requirements. And in this case, that really is one person, one vote, to ensure that we have the lowest possible deviations. And so we adjust our own constitutional provisos to meet the federal Constitution provisos because it has primacy. And then finally, we look at public input that comes through the hearing process of the board, and we adjust and maneuver the map from that. So this cycle, I presented to the board and I talked about the various issues that they had to address that were clear to me from the population numbers that came out of the census. The census released their numbers around August 11th or 12th that gave the board 30 days to produce an initial map. Under our Constitution, they have to do it in 30 days. Then they had 60 days after that to get public input before they would produce a final map. That final map will be produced by November 10th. After that, there'll be 30 days to litigate that map, to basically file lawsuits if there's disagreement with that map by any interested parties. And then the courts will fast track consideration of those lawsuits. Here were the key issues that were likely to come up, though, with this map. First, both the Mat-Su borough and Anchorage were underpopulated. Mat-Su had just under 6 seats at 5.84, meaning 5 seats and 84% of a 6 seat. And Anchorage was at nearly 16 at 15 full seats and then 88% of another seat. This means these two areas, which are boroughs, should add population from outside of their boroughs so that they can have that controlling interest of 16 and 6. Kenai and Fairbanks, on the other hand, were overpopulated, but of rather than rounding up, rounding down. So each of them, should have 3 seats for the Kenai, 5 seats for the Fairbanks North Star Borough, but the excess population, in Fairbanks' case, nearly a quarter of a seat, should go to some adjoining district, and then Kenai's excess population should also go outside of its district. In Southeast, you had 4 House districts currently, but it's underpopulated. significantly so that Yakutat, which is presently in with Kodiak under the current plans, Yakutat would likely have to be added to Southeast to give it enough population. And even then, it's still underpopulated. But you can draw four nearly identical districts, as the card says here, with between minus 1.5 from the mean to minus 1.35 from the mean. If you add Cordova, then you would have an four overpopulated Southeast districts of nearly plus 2% to 2.52%. The four rural districts also had significant population growth in a couple of them. And so they should be okay in any plan that's drawn. And you will see roughly a North Slope Borough, Northwest Arctic District, one around Bering Straits, one around the Chilista region, one around Bristol Bay region. So usually those are the four. They're slightly overpopulated. You could find ways to reduce them, but there's no real need to do so. So this is one of the four assumptions you can start with. Now I'm using here as an example a map that isn't on the website with the board right now. This is a map that the Minority Caucus has presented in testimony to the board, but is not part of our official map. And I'm only using this as an example. I'm not recommending it to you, but it illustrates the point. Here you can see a District 40, which is North Slope, Northwest Arctic Borough, a District 39 around Bering Straits in the north part of the Chilista region, a 38, which is the heart of the Chilista region in Bethel, and a 37, which has Dillingham bases. You can also see a large number 6 there, and that is the Doyon region, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that gives you a picture of how these maps begin to get constructed. Here's a picture of a Southeast with a slight extension up to Yakutat. That's the Yakutat Borough. That area to the left of the yellow line that is on the parallel that marks our otherwise eastern border of Alaska, that's all unpopulated part of the Yakutat Borough, but it is part of the borough, so you include it in the borough distinction. And that has a close correlation, as you can tell, to Cordova, which is just on the other side of that borough boundary. You can see here a 36, a 33, a 34, and a 35. These are the four districts that are relatively similar. It should be noted that because Juneau nearly constitutes the same population as a Senate district, the courts would see that it needs to be held together as a Senate district with two House districts dominated by Juneau. The same is true up in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, where the city of Fairbanks has enough population to account for nearly one Senate seat, so its two House districts should be made up predominantly of the city of Fairbanks within the Fairbanks North Star Borough. This is what that same Southeast map looks like if you put Cordova in. You notice it extends just to the edge of Prince William Sound there. So you see a 32 to the left, 35 is the lighter green, 32 is the darker green, 32 is where Valdez is located in this map. This is just an example, if you put Cordova in, what that district might look like. So here's with just Yakutat, and here's with Cordova added. So you see the difference. If you do this, all four of those districts in Southeast continue to be relatively the other three continue to be relatively compact, and all four of these districts have relatively the same population. Here is examples of what you do with the Mat-Su and Anchorage, where they gather additional votes. If you look at the lower of these two maps, this is South Anchorage coupled with the area of Hope, Moose Pass, Cooper Landing, and then just into the edge of Sterling. So taking in the excess population Anchorage needs to take that 88% of a district and round it up to a full district. And you'll note Whittier, that little appendage to the right, that's the Whittier area just through the tunnel from Portage. That is also added to create what becomes an effectively 16th Anchorage dominated district. Mat-Su, if you look at the top right, is the same thing. That is the eastern side of the Mat-Su, that number 12. It goes up all the way to Delta Junction and following the Richardson Highway, and it goes south following the Richardson Highway, includes Glen Allen, and then a large effectively unpopulated area in the southeast coordinate there. So that's how you acquire excess, how these areas that are just shy of a 6th seat in Mat-Su and 16th in Anchorage acquire the additional population. Court rulings have said Anchorage or Mat-Su can acquire from the south, from the east, or from the north. but they are not, the courts have not seen them with an ability to acquire from the West. And the answer to that is why? Because they're not socioeconomically integrated to the West. They are, all three of them, the Kenai, Matsu, and Anchorage, all three are socioeconomically integrated to the South, the East, and the North. So that's something worth noting. The courts have seen that. This is an example of an interior district. To the right, to the immediate right was the original plan from the map drawn by the Senate Minority Caucus. After testimony, we took the testimony of folks from Atna, from Doyon, and we changed our map, and that's the map on the right, to eliminate Cordova, which is included in the map on the left, take it out, put it in southeast, and then really follow the Atna and the Doyon boundary lines. And this illustrates, if you look at the little insert toward the center of the map, and I don't know if my cursor shows here, but if it does, that area right there, that is Fairbanks North Star Borough. Fairbanks North Star Borough has an excess population of 23%. You have to allocate it somewhere to ensure that that excess population gets a one person, one vote representation. In this case, it's all allocated to one district, and it's a district that's relatively closely economically tied, and certainly through transportation corridors, air transportation hubbed in Fairbanks, postal transportation hubbed in Fairbanks. It's all sort of integrated with the TCC, Tanana Chiefs region, etc. So you have socioeconomic integration, etc. And that's what the court will be looking for in a final map. So this is a reflection of testimony has shaped the map, and that's gotten us to this place. So let's continue. This is an example of how the Kenai sheds its excess population. To the left is a map that we originally proposed. To the right, it's a similar map. It's very, very similar. The only change is a little bit around the Seldovia area. And then you'll note both the District 28 and District 32 both take population from the Kenai Peninsula borough. And it's unusual for the court to allow a borough to be what they call broken twice, meaning that it gives its excess population to more than one district. In fact, the court has said, try to maintain only a single district, but they draw an exception, and that exception is if it is not practicable to do so, or if it serves the interest of creating fairer map as a whole. And in this case, because of the limits of where the Kodiak borough can draw a population, it can go from Valdez, but it can't really go to the west because those districts are pretty well populated already. So it has to draw it from somewhere else, and there's excess population in Kenai. So the court would probably accept a map that, and it has in the past, where it's taken this external native population out of the Kenai borough and placed it in with an otherwise non-Kenai population of Kodiak. And in the case of up in the District 28 in the map to the right, it's taken that population and placed it up in Anchorage, which the court has allowed in the past as well. So, per court decisions, boundaries within boroughs must respect city boundaries, but otherwise may be drawn without consideration of deeper perceived relationships. What that means is in 2001, there was a lot of map making around community council boundaries in Anchorage. Those led to high deviations of plus and minus 5% in the Anchorage map. Court said no, it doesn't matter what the neighborhood boundaries are, what you perceive they are. By definition, the municipality of Anchorage, because it's a municipality, is socioeconomically integrated. You can draw those lines anywhere you want within the boundaries of the municipality, and that applied to boroughs as well. By definition, you can draw the lines anywhere you want. So you can get up there as much as you want and say, why am I voting for one person, the guy across the street is voting for somebody else? And the answer is because you both chose to live in the municipality of Anchorage, you're integrated, and there have to be so many seats in Anchorage, so you're going to have different representatives. So that's why I can look out my windows down to Chester Creek and know Harriet Drummond's on the other side there, and Zach Fields is on this side. The overall plan should be within an ideal deviation. Now, you may not be able to read this map or see this, read this insert that I've placed, but this is an example. Oops, sorry about that. This is an example of what we were able to do with the map from the Senate Minority Caucus. The numbers to the far right are the number of people different from the 18,335 mean. And this is important. So the first five up there are Fairbanks North Star Borough. 9 people less, 6 people less, 11 people over, 5 people less, 13 people less. The next one is that broad, huge Doyon district that includes large swaths of rural Alaska. And that one is a deviation of 4.05% minus, and it has the largest number there. And then you jump right back to 25 less, 19 less, 21 less, all the way down to the 7 in what we designate as District 28. That means that from Fairbanks North Star Borough through Mat-Su, through Anchorage, we have deviations of less than 0.14%. And that's important because the courts have identified that technology, that in the O1 case, that technology should allow for lower and lower deviations. So Alaska courts are holding to within urban areas, and they don't specify Anchorage, within urban areas, deviations should be smaller. And if you can show that deviations can be made smaller, then the court has to pay attention to that. So we put this map out there to show the court that you could in fact do that in Fairbanks, Kenai, Mat-Su, and Anchorage, and or Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Mat-Su in particular, and that they needed to pay attention to that. You'll also note that the next 3 are 277 people, 277 people, and 280. Those are the 3 Kenai districts that are held within the Kenai borough proper, that they are by their population allowed to have. And what we're showing there is that even though we had to go above an ideal deviation, this is an example of the ambiguity of urban and also rural. So you can go about 1.5% above the mean, but in doing so, try to keep all 3 of those districts relatively similar in population. The next one is Kodiak District. It's rather low in deviation. And then the next 4 are the Southeast districts. And you can see the first 2 are actually identical in population. Those are the 2 Juneau districts. And then the next 2 are relatively similar as well. All staying within a small range of, in this case, 2.1 to about 2.5% above. Now, the reason that, and then you'll note the last 4 are rather all over the map, and that's because they are those very isolated western ones I showed you in the very first map. And those, the court recognizes the difficulty, and they actually speak to the difficulty of that process in rural Alaska. And so they've generally allowed higher deviations in those districts, both plus and minus, to account for the very disparate and very isolated populations that are in those areas. So I know this is a lot of information. I'm hoping that you'll have some of your questions here, but we just have a couple of other considerations for you to weigh. If you do further break populations like the North Slope, Northwest Arctic Borough, you can lower the overall map deviation, but the court would see it as unnecessary because you'd be breaking a borough when you don't need to. And then finally, the only time you have an exception really to the deviation argument is when public people comment, and you try to accommodate where possible on the record, as long as there's a public policy reason to do so. You will try to accommodate those changes. So we've provided a latest Senate minority map. Again, I'm not advocating for it. I'm just using it as an example to show that you can do this. That has a overall deviation on the map of 6.74%. And that should accommodate board comments and testimony. So again, to reiterate, you start with that Hickel process of a blank map. You build around socioeconomic relationships, contiguity, and compactness. You then measure that against one person, one vote. You then take in public input and public information, and then you produce, ideally, a final map. So concluding thoughts are, if you know you must move outside of Mat-Su and Anchorage and not have one of those move into the other because they both need to draw in new population, and if you know that Fairbanks and Kenai have to shed their population to other areas, then that gives you the basis for building a really clean map that the courts would recognize. So you're acknowledging that issue, you're acknowledging it because you used the Hickel process, and the court would see that. Second, you know how to build districts within these 4 populated boroughs as you know where the excess population is drawn from or shed. So that helps you. And then finally, if you understand that rural and south districts might be maintained at a near equilibrium between them with slight variations that account for population shifts, then you can quickly resolve those and then focus on the problem areas of dealing with Valdez, Cordova, and the interior. So I'll open it up here to questions. I know that was fast, and I apologize for those of you who are running to catch up with that. Before I go to the questions, though, let me just say that where we are now is the last day of public testimony being accepted by the board will be a written testimony on the 1st. They are going to have a call in tomorrow starting at 10 a.m. You can go to the board website to submit testimony, or you can call in to their testimony. Their line is at their website. Alaska Redistricting is what you search for in your Google search engine to get there. When they promulgate their map, there will be 30 days for lawsuits to be filed. So those reviews of those maps have to happen rapidly, and then the courts will move rapidly to deal with these maps and try to resolve them in a timely enough manner so that candidates can know with some certainty where they will be running for office. That's one of the keys. Currently, the board has been doing a pretty robust public input process. They've been very slow at getting the oral testimony typed into the record, so that will make it problematic for lawsuits that are filed. And there's also been a movement by the board to prioritize the socioeconomic integration criteria, and that stands in direct contrast with where the courts have seen the Hickel process, which was reaffirmed in the 2001 and the 2011 cycle. So that presents a problem that may confront the board here when it comes to legal action in the long run. There are still 6 plans before the board. They need to narrow it down to one and then present that as their plan by the 10th of November. So with that, I will open it to questions, and I leave it to Cliff to guide me in that process.
Well, thank you very much, for that excellent presentation based on your long experience with reapportionment redistricting. I want to start out with a question that a board member asked me, which is, can you describe and elaborate on some of the differences that the factors that drive the differences between the 6 plans? You described the 2 plans the board has put together and offered, plus the 4 that come from groups external to the board.
You mean describe the process of how that happened?
Yeah, and what some of the choices are. You can.
Sure.
It's up to you to just describe it. How much you want to discuss motivations.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to discuss motivations because it's difficult to determine them.
Sure.
So there are 4 groups. There were 5 groups that submitted maps. The board rejected the Democratic Party maps and accepted 4 other groups: the Senate Minority Caucus, Alaskans for Fair Redistricting, which is a group generally would be more on the progressive side of things, Alaskans for Fair and Equitable Redistricting, AFFER, which is a group that is generally a more conservative group. It's that one's headed by former Republican Party Chair Randy Rudrick, who I've worked in the past with on reapportionment. But and then the 4th group is Doyon itself, working with Sea Alaska and a number of other entities, built a coalition. So we have effectively 2 coalition-built groups, AFFR and Doyon. AFFER's group that is working, I believe, also with Chalista, and then you have the Senate Minority Caucus group. And when we say Senate Minority Caucus, we're the ones that promoted the map, but we actually had Senate Majority members review and offer commentary on the map. They didn't endorse it, but they did comment on it and offer commentary. So what we all did is we all started, if we did it properly, and we did it on our end, we start from the Hickel process. We drew the maps. We believed in the Senate minority, I can speak to our motives, we believed that we had to bring deviations to the lowest place possible. And we initially brought a map forward that had an overall map deviation of 3.17. But that caused us to break borough boundaries. And that really was contrary to the process. So we actually rebuilt the map, and we rebuilt it from the ground up and came with a map that had low deviations of I think it was 4.17% or 15% in the initial map. AFFER, Randy Rudrick's group, took the same approach, low deviations. AFFR really focused on socioeconomic integration, and Doyon really looked at trying to bring all the Atna and Doyon villages into a group and then build a map out from that. Valdez has also presented a map in testimony. There's some issues with that. And then other people have put maps forward through a very robust mapping process that the board has identified. There are different motivations for all of them. My motivation in my map was to try to most fairly get to that one person, one vote, ergo the deviations. And that's why you take in the excess population for the two nearly full districts for Matsu and Anchorage from other areas, and you shed the overpopulation from North Star Borough and Kenai with the same thing in mind. Every person needs to have their vote counted and counted effectively. Board map 3 actually packs all Fairbanks North Star Borough residents into 5 districts in the North Star Borough, which grossly overrepresents the number of the deviations in that borough into the 4th percentile. I am certain the court will not accept that, because the court can see that you can draw 5 districts within that borough that are of nearly equal to the median number, and then take the excess population and have it all go to one district that helps solve a problem of how you deal with rural Alaska. So the court will see that. They'll reject if a map like board map 3 is promulgated, they will almost certainly reject that map on those grounds alone. Board map 4 is a little bit better than that one. It still has fairly high deviations in Fairbanks, but they could be corrected with some minor changes within the city of Fairbanks. And they have really high deviations in Southeast that are unnecessary. You could easily eradicate those deviations. I've recommended that they look at Cordova. There's a lot of controversy around the Cordova issue because in the past, the court has rejected Cordova being in Southeast. But it's important, and I want to put this down there, that the court has said recently in the 2001 case, and I'm looking for it here. I'm looking through my notes. Let me just find it here if you'll bear with me for one moment. The court has said that in the case of Cordova, although we have in the past invalidated Southeast Alaska districts that included Cordova, current population figures justify Cordova's inclusion in House District 5, which was a district that included Sitka, to prevent substantial deviations in Southeast Alaska. Now, that was from the 2002 case. So if it was okay then, I'm certain it is even more okay now as those deviations have only gotten worse. So that's worth noting.
Thank you. Earlier in your description of the process, you mentioned census blocks. Could you go into greater detail on the census blocks and how they affect redistricting?
Absolutely. You're required to use census numbers and you're required to use census blocks. It is a very, very difficult process to get approval to break what's called break a census block. So when you get a weird census block, there's one down by Eek that surrounds the entire city of Eek in Southwest Alaska. If you assign that to Bristol Bay, and you can't assign Eek to Bethel because there's no way to go through that block. You've got to be able to have contiguity. So the blocks prevent us from time to time from doing what might be an appropriate map because of that. So you end up with odd shapes. Now that said, when you go down to the block level, some blocks have as many as 400 or 500 people in them, and some have as few as one person in them, or as I've said, no people. So you can get bizarre shapes as a result of it. So it's very important when you present a map, and if the board or if courts ask you questions about why this weird shape, to be able to say, well, that's because we were given these census blocks by the Census Bureau, and until we revise those, which we can do, there's a process for that, we're stuck with those blocks. So it's like you build a toy castle by putting each block together. We're building toy castles with each of these individual blocks, and they're different shapes. I hope that answers your question, Donna.
Sure. My next question would be, can you speak to the practice of a majority on the board, majority drawing boundaries with an Anchorage to encompass two minority incumbents. And by
Yes.
that, I think the minority refers to a political party and not so much. I'll
Sure,
let you.
sure. Sure, it's a every map draws some incumbents into some district together, and the reason is that populations shift and change. My downtown district lost population, so it's got to move somewhere. Remember, we're starting from a blank slate, and we draw new maps. People are going to be pitted against each other. Reapportionment in Alaska is not about incumbents. And when it becomes about incumbents, you're no longer following the Hickel process because you're
Right.
actually looking at a different criteria than our Constitution identifies. So a good map must be if you will, person blind to where those incumbents live. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. 18 incumbents are pitted against each other in the 2001 map. And the court said, doesn't matter because there's legitimate reasons for why they're up against each other, and those reasons are because you can draw the lines anywhere you want within a municipality, and as long as they're compact and they're contiguous, then you can do it. And so you could infer that there is a nefarious purpose to that, but it would be the court would pay no attention to that argument. Certainly, you make hay with that, but I believe it's a bad policy decision to spend your time searching out people's names and pitting incumbent against incumbent. I think that is a mistake in the process, and it does a dishonor to the process. That said, even our map matches incumbents. I think our map matches our current map matches Zach Fields and Matt Clayman, Ben Carpenter, and I can't remember the other, Ron Gillum, and then David Eastman and Chris Kirker. They're all matched in our map, and we have the fewest number of incumbents mapped in any map of any of the third parties or the board. But in each of those cases, it's a justifiable reason, and we only found out after the fact when those were posted up on the Alaska Landmine website. So it happens.
Right. Another question is that socioeconomic integration is often looked at a macro level, like a borough is assumed to be integrated, as you've repeatedly said. But in urban areas, socioeconomic integration can be looked at a smaller level, like, for example, socioeconomic status, race, neighborhood. What is the source of the understanding of the way socioeconomic integration is presently understood in the courts? And is it as if the courts attempted to consider socioeconomic integration on this smaller micro level?
They have, and I actually, Barbara, I'm glad you asked that question. I actually was the one who promulgated that theory of let's build these things around the most narrow and smallest neighborhood so that we possibly can. And Judge Ridner struck it down with vengeance. And he did so in 2001. We actually promulgated that theory, we put it on the record, and the people who opposed our plan also promulgated that theory. The Looper plaintiffs promulgated that theory, and the Supreme Court had this to say about that. They said, let me find it here. While such patterns, let me find it here. Respect for neighborhood boundaries is an admirable goal, but it is not constitutionally required and must give way to other legal requirements. The Alaska Supreme Court rejected the notions that communities within the Anchorage area are socially and economically distinct. The court held, quote, Anchorage is by definition socioeconomically integrated, and its population is sufficiently dense and evenly spread to allow multiple combinations of compact, contiguous districts with minimal population deviations. And when they say those last phrases, compact, contiguous districts with minimal population deviations, they're speaking both to the intrastate prioritization of contiguity and compactness over socioeconomic integration that I shared with you earlier, and they're speaking to the federal one person, one vote, which is the deviation issue. They felt that using the neighborhood boundaries in urban areas, and they say urban and Anchorage, so they're very careful to say that with technology, this could be expanded in the future to other jurisdictions. They're saying if technology can show that you can do one person, one vote, meaning very, very close deviations in these areas, then you cannot use some secondary level of socioeconomic integration that isn't associational, meaning you voted to do it, you voted to associate, that isn't associational within a borough or municipal boundary. However, in 2013, they were considering and the board went ahead and applied the consideration of a city within a borough, like Fairbanks or Wasilla or Houston or Palmer or Kenai or Soldotna, Homer or Kachemak City. All of those cities within boroughs, because they are associational, meaning you're voting for your elected leaders and you've chosen to become a city within a borough. So there's a whole annexation process. There's a whole that can be used. There's all these elected processes that actually has higher distinction, and the court has begun to see that piece. So they haven't gone to community council boundaries, which are established by charter and then changed by charter. They are looking though at these elective associational boundaries. So that's kind of interesting and kind of worth looking at potentially maybe at LSRAs within the city and those kinds of things. So that has never been LSRAs, limited road service areas, limited LRSAs, limited road service areas, has never been considered in the past. That might be a place you could begin to wedge it open because those are somewhat associational, even though they are set by charter, they're somewhat associational. So I hope that helps.
I'm going to turn now to a couple of questions that I can combine somewhat that raise some more bold political considerations. Is there, so to combine the two questions into one question, two questions, are there attempts to create through the reapportionment process a more Republican legislature? And is that the theory of why some of the logjam or roadblocks we see in the legislature, the belief we're just going to wait until after the November 2022 elections and get what we want? And I would add, can you separate the sort of belief about what the reapportionment process will bring by what the numbers are bringing, if I'm making sense? It's obviously true that the managed to sit in a borough is growing and some other areas are not or are shrinking in our state.
Well, let me take the latter part first. The Matsu Borough right now has actually 6 legislators. They just happen to have a portion of an Anchorage district as part of one of those legislators. So effectively what's happening because of their growth and Anchorage's loss of population is Anchorage no longer will provide persons to help that 6th Matsu district. That'll
Right.
come from somewhere else. And so Anchorage will go from having 16 and a third to having 16 House members, and Matsu will go from having 5 and a quarter to having 6 folks. So there's really no material change, and demographically, those areas politically are relatively similar. The more nefarious question about what's going on with supermajorities in legislatures is that those legislatures control the process. That's not the case in Alaska. While this is not an independent board, it is relatively independent, and it has to go up against our courts and really, really clear decisions that our courts have made regarding how we gerrymander and how we don't gerrymander. Now, we have one of the fairest court systems in the country. And I will say parenthetically, since there's an audience online here, that we should do everything we can to preserve that by defending the Constitution. But that said, these courts have consistently pushed back against blatant efforts to gerrymander. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And before, the governor got to pick all 5 members of the board, and that there was the effort to change that process was to take the power away, from Governor Knowles. Ironically, it ended up creating a fairer board, and who knew? But so we don't have that problem, but that's why we have a legal process. Because if we do see a map produced that does do that, and I think in the direction the board is going right now, whether that's the intent or not, that could be the cause. If you pack all those people up in Fairbanks, if you do that, you end up basically rolling Matsu voters into Anchorage. And that if I, as an Anchorage voter, I'd file suit against that because it's going to take away my representational rights as a member of this associational relationship I have with the municipality of Anchorage. And so, it can happen. Certainly there's pressure for people to get more progressive or more conservative districts, but the process, because of our court system, is relatively fair here.
Thanks. Are there similar, this goes to another question, are there similar submarine tables that show the deviation for the other maps mentioned that can show apples to apples comparisons?
Yes, and the problem is you have to really they'll have to look at their tables. We all the different plaintiff groups use different numbering systems because we draw different districts. So you have to actually look at the map, look at the numbers, assign the numbers to a particular place, Homer district or Wasilla district or whatever you may do, East Anchorage, West Anchorage. And so, but we all of those deviation tables are online at the board. Regretfully, the board, because they aren't accepting map updates on a regular basis, which the 01 and the 13 boards did, you can't see the latest version of, say, our map, the Senate Minority Map, or AFFR's latest version, or Dorion's or AFFER's latest versions. All of us, all four of the third-party groups, have attempted to modify our maps based on public testimony and comments by the board. So it's a disservice to the public that you can't see those. However, the board staff is doing their best to try to get that stuff posted, and so it's apples to apples based on what we all submitted September 17th, and hopefully the court will have a chance to see the other maps that have been produced and put on the public record and their deviation tables. I certainly am happy to share mine with anybody who is interested.
Okay. There's also a question that's more parochial and also more pointed and said, if this is from a person who lives in South Anchorage, several of the maps combine her South Anchorage precinct with Kenai Peninsula Borough precincts. She would not be she prefer not to be combined with Kenai voters. She thinks her South Anchorage community has more, and so it's more in common with Nikiski and not Cooper Landing or Sterling. And so she asked one precise question she asked is, why did your Senate minority map choose that excess population to join Cooper Landing and not Nikiski? And she thanks you for the presentation.
I appreciate that. The primary reason is there's a road. You can actually drive from South Anchorage to your first stop as you get out of the municipality. If you want, you can take the Hope bypass, or you can go down through Turnagain Pass and you can hit Moose Pass or go to Cooper Landing, and it follows the road because the road is transportation corridors are identified all the way back to the Grow case. That would be your dad, by the way.
Yeah.
And the Grow case, the Egan v. Grow or Grow v. Egan, and also all the way back to Wade. That is part of our definition of socioeconomic integration. Nikiski, on the other hand, you'd have to actually go through another district to get to Nikiski. If we had a ferry going to Nikiski on a regular basis, that would actually constitute a corridor of transportation. We don't even fly to Nikiski. We fly to Kenai Soldotna. And so that's not even a clean cut, nor is Kenai Soldotna contiguous. So that's why we drew the map that way. That said, to say voting patterns are necessarily a consideration of similarity is actually not accepted by the courts. That is an absolute, because voting patterns change. Girdwood doesn't vote the same way, quite frankly, as the north part of the South Anchorage district. They vote completely different ways, and they're all integrated into the same House district today. The other thing that's important to note here is that you have to deal with the excess Anchorage population, or you're denying the excess population a fair ability to have their vote counted. And you have to go somewhere to do that. And the only place where you can draw in that excess population is from the only district, the borough that can shed it. And that happens to be Kenai. Valdez is too large. Matsu has to get new population as well. So if you take away from them, they just have a larger deficit. So that doesn't solve the problem. And that's what the court will look at as well. So, I mean, yeah, I know nobody I mean, you know, I'm written into 2 or 3 districts that tie me into the base. I don't really have a connection to the base, but you know, I may end up in the base. That's just the way it goes.
As a guy who lives next to the base, I'm very close to the base. Base is
I love
great.
the
Base
base.
is great.
Don't get me wrong. I
But
mean,
my point though is, yeah, and
I
we don't live that far apart, but obviously you
yeah.
walk across some different political territory to get there.
Well,
Um,
under most of these maps, Cliff, even though you and I are less than a mile apart, we'll be in 2 different districts. And just parenthetically, I did actually spend my first 3 years on base because my dad was the superintendent of base
sure.
schools.
Right. Another question is, do you think that or believe that the board will see the revised third-party map somehow before November 10th?
Well, yeah, I mean, if they choose to, I submitted mine on Thursday, so they have them. And I submitted mine incorporating comments made to me directly by Doyon. I added those into my maps because I've said to every one of the third party groups, tell me what you want. I'll put it in my map if I think it makes rational and constitutional sense. And they made good rational constitutional arguments. I incorporated them and I submitted them to the board with commentary in writing because that's the only way I'm sure that it's going to actually make it to the record. Um, so yeah, you know, I think that they will see my maps, and I know that they have seen Randy Rudrick's maps because he submitted them 2.5, 3 weeks ago. And you know, look, the staff is looking at these things. They're up all night. I had a board member contact me this morning and tell me that they'd seen, just to tell me that they'd seen the maps. That's all. And I do want to just really briefly touch on the algorithm question, if I can, Cliff.
Sure.
The algorithm question is absolutely the wrong way to do this, and I'm going to tell you why. It's an algorithm written in the lower 48 that's going to be applied to areas that have counties and that have structures that are fully populated with transportation networks and corridors that are small dirt roads or paved roads. We do not have those. It would do a disservice to our Alaska Native population in particular, and also the uniqueness of Alaska's geography if we used an algorithm. We'd end up with circular districts that ignored our socioeconomic relationships. And our founding fathers, it's in the minutes of the Constitutional Convention, did not want to do that. They wanted a map process, making process that would significantly limit gerrymandering, and that's why they adopted the standards they did, which were those contiguity, compactness, and socioeconomic integration. And that is why the courts continue to narrow that deviation, continue to define that contiguity and compactness, and continue to enhance the socioeconomic integration elements of our constitutional restrictions. That's the way you deal with this, with real people, not with algorithms.
I want to wrap this up and thank you. There have been the Q&A function has brought in additional thank yous for you. I'm going to do a virtual applause for you in terms of doing this. Thank you for all your work before the board and obviously taking the time to talk to us on this Friday evening. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to and Tom.
Before you do, I want to thank you guys and also do a shout out to my good friend Kathy Giesel, who I noticed was online earlier. And Ian, I'm happy to answer your question offline. Just send me a text and I'll answer it.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Dick Milius. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for an informative presentation and discussion. And thank you to Kari Gardy, who has been running the Zoom show this evening and has me mute my camera shut down. So that's why you can't see me. Oh, I guess you just approved me to start my video. So she has control. So thank you to Kari. Thank you also for your support on attending this evening. And if you're not a member of Alaska Common Ground, we encourage you to go to our website to join or donate to support Alaska Common Ground's work towards an engaged Alaska democracy. There's a link in the chat for donations, and there also will be a link on our website for watching this presentation if your friends or neighbors missed it. Please stay healthy and engaged. Have a good evening. And again, thank you, Tom, for an excellent presentation.
Thanks.